So good morning. My name is JB Rainsberger. You can find me at jbrains on Twitter, jbrains.ca for reading more. .ca for Canada, of course. And if you have any questions and you don't get to ask them today, and you don't get to ask me today, then you can always go to ask.jbrains.ca and ask me a question, and eventually I'll answer you. And I can't emphasize enough eventually. It might take a while, I promise you. If you need answers quicker, we can talk about how much that costs. So I'm not really sure exactly all the things that I'm going to talk about this morning, but I do have sort of one overall goal. And that's the goal pretty much that has emerged with all my work over the last 20 years, and that is to help people work with less stress. So everything I say this morning has the aim of providing you some of the best tricks that I have for working with less stress. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that's important, apart from the obvious. And so we will see how far we get. If you have any questions like, I didn't understand what you just said, I'm stuck, I'm going to sit here for 10 minutes like this if I don't get an answer, then please just ask. And if there's something that comes into your mind and you think, oh, this is something I want to ask him later, or I wonder about this, then I really encourage you to write that down. And the reason that I want you to write that down is to get it out of your head so that you can focus on what's happening and be here. I think that young programmers, and especially young male programmers, have this interesting habit of assuming that they can keep everything in their head. And that has a tendency to slow them down. And remember that I was once a young male programmer, so I get to make that joke. Okay, let me start with one of the most common problems that I see with all my clients, but with programmers in particular, is that they follow practices or they adopt practices and techniques, and they don't really have a clear idea why. So I kind of want to start there. I figured that, since we do have probably a fair number of programmers in the room, that if I don't talk about something related to programming, then you'll all go to sleep right away. So let's talk a little bit about programming. And one of the places that I really like to start is I'm a big fan of simple rules that generate pretty good behavior. It's not that I want rules to govern everything that I do, but I do like the idea that if I know a couple of small rules and they guide me to do something good 80% of the time, then that saves an awful lot of energy to deal with the other 20%. And so one of the places that I would like to start is with something as silly as the 4 elements of simple design. So if you've heard this before, you can take about a 6-minute nap. And even if you have heard this before, then you might not have. Apparently there's a divot in the rug. Apparently you might not have heard it quite this way before. So I'd like to see what happens. So as a programmer, of course, maybe I should back up a moment. Why do we care about design at all? What is design? Software design is one of these things that we have a tendency to talk about without really having a clear picture of what it means at all. So I'd like to provide or propose an idea, a conception of what design is by simply saying that it's a way of organizing code, and that the only reason we need to organize code is because we will need to change it. If we never needed to change code, then it wouldn't be important to organize it, right? If computers designed systems, do you think the computers will care about how to organize the code? No, of course not, because they can think billions of times more quickly than we can. They can just reverse engineer the behavior of the entire system, throw it all away, generate brand new code that behaves the way the new system should behave, and do that more quickly than we can figure out how to hit F6 in our IDE to rename a variable. And so a computer would never worry about organizing code, but we need to do it because we're just not that fast. And that organizing code really boils down to 2 ideas. We need to know which part of the code we need to change, so we need to find it, which means we need to know where to look for it. So we need to do things like putting things where we are likely to look for them. And then we need a way to be able to change those things confidently. And that's why we might use something like tests. So The 4 elements of simple design are just someone's opinion about what simple could mean. I think it's one place to start. A lot of the stuff that we do, a lot of the stuff that we talk about, that we propose to each other, are not laws, they're not theories, they're opinions, they're guidelines, they're heuristics. We had this wonderful discussion last night about what heuristic really means. And heuristic really comes from the Greek evrisko, which means I find or I discover. And these are things that we did because we thought they might be a good idea, and then we realized, hey, some of the results are pretty good, let's keep doing it. Even if we don't really understand the mechanism of why it works, let's keep doing it until we figure out what that mechanism is. So design is about organizing code so that we can find the thing that we need to change, and we use tests so that we can change it safely. And that leads to 4 elements of simple design. These are ideas that came from Kent Beck. At least he was the first person to write them down that I read. I don't know where he learned them from. I'm guessing he didn't invent them. And the first one has to do with tests. Because as Jerry Weinberg once observed, if we don't have to compute the correct answer, then we're done now. So that's the first thing. I don't care how well your code is organized if it doesn't work. And then the next thing is duplication. And after that, we have clarity. And then finally, we have small. So the 4 elements of simple design work like this. Simple means, let's propose that simple means passes the tests, minimizes duplication, maximizes clarity. I think that's probably reasonable. We want less duplication and more clarity. And then is otherwise small. Now, it turns out that if you use these simple guidelines long enough, one of the first things that you'll notice is that after a while, writing tests doesn't seem like an interesting thing. What I mean is that it doesn't seem surprising. It becomes just a normal part of what you do. Most of you in this room, if you describe what you do to other people, you probably do not say that I am an object-oriented programmer. But if we roll back the clock to about 1991, there's a good chance that some of you in this room working in C++ would probably want to say, I'm an object-oriented programmer, because back then, object-oriented would stand out. It would be something different about what you're doing than the norm. And if you go back to 1978, you wouldn't say, I'm a structured programmer. But in 1965, you might want to point that out. My point is that at some point, the prevailing way that we write software just becomes known as programming. And if you write tests long enough, and especially if you write them first, after a while, you just start referring to that as programming, and therefore you really don't need this rule number 1 anymore. Just like you don't have to think about how to walk. If you had to think about all the muscular contractions that it took to send the signals to your, to send the signals to various parts of your body to walk, you would fall over after the first 2 steps. It's important at some point that this become entirely autonomic, something that you do without conscious thought. So after a while, writing tests just becomes programming. Kent Beck tells the story of his 9-year-old daughter at the time watching him write code, and then he tried to write code without tests, and she asked him, will Smalltalk let you do that? So that's what I'm talking about. At some point, it just becomes what you do. Now, it also turns out that I've never seen a code base where there were a lot of good tests, and duplication was quite low, and clarity was quite high, but the code base was too big. It never comes up. So if you do the first 3 well, you don't need the 4th one. So that one goes as well. I would have to say that if anyone in this room could show me a code base that does the first 3 things well and is an order of magnitude too big, good. I would like to know who wrote that code base so I could stay away from them as far as I can. It seems to me that you would almost have to be malicious in order to make that happen. So now we're left with reducing duplication and improving clarity. Now the problem with clarity, well, duplication, I think we can agree. If you and I look at 2 things, we can probably agree that they are duplicated. Either they're identical, or they're very similar structures, or they play similar roles, or they're the third step in a 5-step algorithm, something like that. We can fairly easily agree on what duplication means and whether something in code is duplicated. But clarity is much more subjective. I think one of the first things that we really need to understand with clarity is that clarity is not a property of the code. Clarity is a property of the relationship between us and the code. I will find something clear that you do not find clear. And that might be that I'm nuts, and that might simply be that I have 12 years of experience with this programming language and you have 6 months. And that might be that I have been bitten by the bug of functional programming and you haven't. And therefore, I see this long concatenation of really simple library functions with weird names. That seems clear to me, whereas you look at that and say, what the hell is that? So clarity is especially important to remember that it's a relationship between you and the code. It's not a property of the code. Code isn't readable. Code isn't clear. I can find it easy to read code, and I can find it clear. And that's about as far as we can go. But even less than that, before we get there, clarity is, because it's so subjective, it's very difficult for us to agree on what clarity means. And we could spend lots of time arguing about what clarity means. And I find that that doesn't really help. I have found, however, that names are responsible for about 80% of what clarity means. In practice, on average, the kinds of things that people look for when they think about clarity, most of that has to do with names. When the name of the thing doesn't match the thing, then there is war. And so you might have names just side by side that seem strange together. There's a very domain-sounding, businessy-sounding name right next to a very hardcore technology infrastructure-y sounding name. And now my question is, why are these two names in the same statement? Or you might have the same name in 13 places around the code, but spread out away from each other, as though they're trying to avoid each other so that they don't have to have an awkward conversation. And then you have the problem where names and duplication sort of feed each other together. You have the same name spread out throughout the system in multiple places. And that's kind of where I want to go next. It turns out that duplication in names, well, there was an old argument about how to structure this list, because 1 is more urgent than 2, 2 is more urgent than 3, 3 is more urgent than 4. I'm willing to copy and paste code in order to make a test pass. And then once the test passes, I can breathe and I can figure out how to remove that duplication a different way. Now, I know deep in my bones that this is the correct way, the one true way to order this list. And Corey Haynes, my good friend, knows deep in his bones that there's only one true way to order this list, and that is tests, reveal intent, don't repeat yourself, make it smaller. And for years, I knew I was right, and he knew he was right, and we couldn't tell why. Until gradually, we both independently discovered that there's this very tight feedback loop between duplication and names. And it kind of goes like this. So when we remove duplication, we create containers for things. Those containers are functions, classes, packages, namespaces, modules, whatever you call them in your language. But you create a box. And you take that duplicated stuff and you put it in a box. You used to have 5 copies of it. Now you have 1, safe in this box, very simple. Now if I want to change that part of the system, I go to the box, open the box, change something, close the box, everything's nice. But as soon as I create that box needs something. It needs a name. Because I'm going to have to refer to it at some point. Now we're programmers. Do we name things well? Not particularly. And so once we name things, we're going to need to improve those names. But what happens as we improve the names of these boxes? Well, when the name gets better and better, it becomes easier to trust the inside of the box. And I can treat the box as completely opaque. That's that black box everyone keeps talking about. And then I can treat the box like a thing. The box disappears, and now all I see is a dot. It's a thing. And now suddenly, a whole bunch of boxes, as the names get better and better, those boxes turn into things, and a whole bunch of details that used to bother me, distract me, are gone. And what's left is smaller, fewer things to think of. And when I have fewer things to think of, something wonderful happens. I can start to spot even higher level forms of duplication. Duplication in structure in bigger things. Well, if I spot duplication, what happens next? Well, I take those things and I put them in a box. The box needs a name, the names get better, gradually boxes turn into dots, dots are just things, I have fewer things to think of, and now I can see bigger forms of duplication. And I can do that again, and again, and again, and again as many times as I want. At the end, well, there's no end. As I progress, what I notice is that it becomes increasingly easy to think of any part of the system. Everything looks the same everywhere. At every part of the system, there are these things, and then if I zoom in on the thing actually turns into a box. And then if I'm interested in fixing that part of the system, I open the box. And then I look inside, and there's another universe with a bunch of dots. And then if I think that I need to fix this dot over here, as I look closer, the dot turns into a box, then I open the box, and I can keep going until eventually I end up with return 12. Okay, great. Every part of the system now is relatively easy to understand. And because the names are good, I trust those names. And because we have relatively low duplication, I can figure out which of these dots I need to zoom in on. And then look inside there and figure out which of these dots I need to zoom in on, and so on. Now, what have I just done here? Well, here's another one of those magic words that programmers tend to use without really understanding what it means. Abstraction. Abstraction is a word that senior programmers use to make junior programmers feel like they don't know what they're doing. But if you ask the senior programmer what abstraction means, they often don't have a good answer. So I propose that abstraction has one and really only one useful meaning, and that is to hide details. So this is exactly what Kevlin mentioned this in his talk. And that good abstraction is hiding irrelevant details, and bad abstraction is hiding essential details, I guess. I don't know. I don't tend to see a lot of bad abstractions. The important thing is that notice when I talked about the link or the feedback loop between duplication and names, notice what happened there. At the stages where I was focusing on names, it became easier to figure out which details to hide. And when you hide details, that's not just about abstraction as a way of creating elegant software systems, because let me let you in on a secret. I do not care about things like elegance. I am with my good friend Mike Hill when he talks about his underplayed premises of test-driven development, where he says, I'm in it for the money. Now that doesn't mean that we get paid a lot of money, although that we might. But I'm in all of this because it helps me produce better results. And actually, I'll be honest, I'm not really just in it for the money. I'm in it for reducing stress. And the fact that that also helps my employer save money or generate more profit is a pleasant side effect for them. That's probably why they pay me. But I'm really in it for myself. I'm in it because the more that we hide irrelevant details, the less there is to distract me. There's less there is for me to think about. I find it much easier to then walk through the code and change it as it needs to be changed. And there isn't this noise distracting me all the time. Now, I don't have the same kinds of experiences that Michael and Kevlin talked about with synesthesia. In fact, I kind of have the opposite problem. I can't visualize. I'm extremely textual. So even when I try to speak in a different language, I actually see the words flashing in my brain as I'm talking. I don't see images and pictures and that kind of thing. I don't know. I guess I grew up as a programmer at the right time when everything was plain text. And so my whole brain was rewired to work in plain text. It's just a big plain text machine up here. And so being able to hide details just means that a whole bunch of that noise goes away. And it's much easier for me to figure out what to do next. And that makes me a hell of a lot calmer. That makes it much easier for me to keep track of what it is that I need to do. So this is, didn't necessarily want to turn this into a symposium on test-driven development. That's not the point. But the point is that I'm not adopting these ideas because they produce better designs, although they do. And I'm not adopting these ideas because I produce better results, although I do. I do it because this helps me relax. This helps me work with less stress. This loop of removing duplication and improving names just means that there's less for me to think about anytime I need to change something. There's less for me to worry about. The tests means that I can feel comfortable while I'm doing my work as a programmer. I've been waiting to try this experiment for a while, so those of you who maybe went to some of the early extreme programming agile software conferences, it was very common, it was a bit of a tradition that there would be a room where you could go in and pair program, because that was still something that nobody did. You would go in, and there would be a code base sitting there throughout the whole conference, and you would go in, and if you wanted to write code for a while, there was almost always somebody there for you to write code with so that you could experience pair programming, and then maybe you could experience pair programming with a celebrity for various definitions of celebrity. And I always thought, you know, that's an interesting thing, that's fun. And then I read a wonderful book called The Power of Full Engagement. It's one of these strikingly American marketing titles. But really the idea was that sort of at the end of the probably 1990s, people started to realize that the time management craze was actually scratching the surface of personal productivity, and what really seemed to matter was managing your own energy. And the two people who wrote this book, The Power of Full Engagement, that was their central thesis. Manage energy, not time. And I think now we're really starting to see that becoming a much more popular idea as well. All the stuff about modern mindfulness and all that seems to be also about managing energy. And the story they told was kind of compelling. It was the thing that made me really sit up and take notice. So I'll share it with you in case it has a similar effect on you. So they did research on tennis players. And what they did is they tried to figure out what it was that made the top tennis players in the world really the top players. So they were roughly speaking wondering what's the difference between being in the top 20 and being in the top 200. So they analyzed tennis players. They interviewed them, they ran physical tests, they reviewed matches, they talked to them about strategy, they talked to them about tactics. And it turned out that by and large, the players in the top 200 had all the same qualities of the players in the top 20. They knew what shots they had to make. They knew their own strengths and weaknesses. They knew the strengths and weaknesses of their opponents. They had similar physical fitness. The quality of their shots was quite similar. And so it really was kind of, well, then why is it that this player's 172nd and this player's 18th? And then as they looked through the matches and did some physical measurements with them, they realized that the top 20 players did something that the other players didn't do. In between points, as they're walking back to the baseline, getting ready to serve, or walking back to the baseline, getting ready to receive the serve, they dropped their heart rate by 15 to 20 beats per minute lower than their opponents. They were literally physically conserving energy. And what that meant was that they had a lot more energy at the end of the match. And this seemed kind of odd to me, but if you take a look at the results of tennis tournaments, so the way they work is usually there are 64 players, and they just play in a single elimination playdown. So that means that in the first 2 rounds, you might have the number 2 seed against the number 63 seed, or the number 7 seed against the number 59 seed. Usually the first one will be in the top 20 in the world and the other won't. And especially this is striking in men's matches because we still have this weird sexist system where men play 5 sets, but women only play 3. So it's a little easier to see this in men's matches, that the top seeded player in the first 2 rounds will lose 2 of the first 3 sets and then destroy their opponent in the last 2. And that is the energy kicking in. That is what happens with that conserving energy. And I think something similar happens when I see those tests pass. What I'd really like to do is to go back to those conference sessions, now that we can do it, and hook those programmers up to heart rate monitors and watch what happens when the tests pass. And especially watch what happens when they go 6, 7, 8 minutes without passing tests. And I'm willing to bet that the programmers that we think of as good, the ones that are the thought leaders, the ones that we pay attention to, when the places where we go when we have questions, I'll bet that when they see those tests pass, their heart rate goes way down. I would love to try it. If you get the chance to do it, please do it and report the results. And when I put it that way, the specific mechanism doesn't really matter. In my case, it happens to be evolutionary design, and test-driven development is the implementation that I like. And you don't have to do it this way. I'm not asking you to do it this way. I'm not even suggesting that you do it this way. I'm merely saying that this was one of the things that allowed me to feel less stressed, to literally lower my heart rate while I'm doing my work. And so what I'd like to do is to share a few more ideas about things that I've incorporated into my work and my life that essentially allow me to do the same thing. That really what I'm in it for is less stress. Now, that less stress helps me do something wonderful while working, and that is focus. If you've never really experienced working with real focus for long periods of time, then you don't know what you're missing. If you're constantly worried about what you might need to do later this afternoon, what you might need to do later this week, what you might need to do later this month, where the project is going, and never really get a chance to focus in on what you're working on, I swear you don't know what you're missing. The good news is I have one suggestion for how you might start to get there. So a while ago I wrote, well, I wouldn't say wrote, I drew an article. Oops. I knew I was going to make a mistake at least once. And I like to use these really ridiculous, over-the-top marketing titles because, you know, that's how marketing works. That I called A Proven Path to Effectiveness, which is certainly not proven. Or if you want, I can let you assume that I mean proven in that sense when I could just argue, well, I mean proven in the sense of test, because that's what the word prove really means. Not guaranteed effectiveness. So here's you, stressed, distracted, in pain, not sure what to do, and probably at the point where you're ready to try just about anything. So one of the things that I can suggest is that if you start to get control of your own workload, then you'll find everything else a lot easier. What you can assume in here is that energy is your bottleneck. So this is one of the things that I wanted to really mention here today, perhaps the centerpiece of all this. Energy is almost certainly your bottleneck. I mean, in a sense, it's literally true. Your ability to do everything depends on how much energy you have and how well you manage it. And so basic theory of constraints would tell you that if energy is your bottleneck, then everything you do in life that isn't about managing and improving your energy is, I wouldn't say a waste of time, but is just developing spare capacity. So I want to be able to do some of this stuff, but I don't have time. There's not enough time. I hear that a lot. Did anybody here by chance read a nice book called Planning Extreme Programming? I know we're getting old enough that maybe, okay. So in that book, this is the book by Kent Beck and Martin Fowler that nobody remembers. In that book is a wonderful chapter title that deals with this whole question of, I don't have time. Because the problem with I don't have time is there's not a lot you can do about that. You can't create time. As far as I know, there's no law of physics that allows us to create time. No matter what you do, you have the same amount of time as you had a second ago. They talk about flipping that around and telling yourself, reframing that simply as, I have too much to do. Because not enough time is not a problem you can solve, but too much to do makes it possible all of a sudden. There's one extra possible strategy that comes up when you say that I have too much to do. And you're going to laugh, but it's do less. It's not that you don't have enough time, it's that you have too much to do. So you need to do less. You don't have a choice. There's no other way to win that game. If you don't figure out how to do less, you will remain stuck forever. And there are a lot of people who want to fool themselves into believing that no, it's fine, I'll be able to do all this, it's great. I haven't overcommitted, everything is fine, don't worry about it. And I take them through this nice little exercise. So it goes like this. You might want to try this yourself. Not now. Take a piece of paper, one should be enough, and write down Just get out of your head, write down all the projects that you think you want to work on. Everything that interests you that you want to work on. And when I say project, I mean just something that requires more than one step. It doesn't have to be a big thing, it could be a small thing. So there's all the things that you've committed to, all the things that you've told that other people that you're going to do, the things that you've told yourself you're going to do, and the things that you want to do. You could even limit it to the things that you fully intend to do. Live here for 3 months, work on the house, there's some programming projects you want to do, of course there's this job that you have to do, and blah, 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 blah. And then after you're done, in the next column, estimate. Okay, let's stop using these Latin words that don't mean anything. When you replace a good, honest Anglo-Saxon word with a Latin word with more syllables, you somehow fool yourself into thinking that it means something else. Let's take out estimate, replace it with guess. Guess how long it will take for you to do those projects. It doesn't have to be accurate, that's why it's called a guess. And just guess, in weeks, months, years, days, whatever the right unit of time seems to be. And then when you're done all that, add it all up. Just add up all the numbers, and then drop everything but the 2 most significant units of time. And if you do that, you'll probably end up with a number that's measured in decades and years. That's my guess. Most people, it ends up being there. So here are all the projects that you want to do. Add up the time it would take to do them, and at the end, you write, okay, 4 decades and 6 years. And it's actually very common for that number to be somewhere between 25 and 70 years. Now it's time for a little arithmetic. I mean, you probably already see where this is going, but let me deliver the punchline anyway. Take your age now, add that number, and ask yourself about the likelihood that you're going to live that long. So that's step 1. Step 2 is the crusher, though. So in my case, let's say that it was 35 years, so I add that to my age now, and that would put me squarely at 79. Okay, I might live to 79. I weigh a little less than I did 10 years ago, so that sort of has me moving in that direction. But then, of course, there's this whole maybe there will be no environment to live in, so I'm not sure. But here's the thing. If I do everything I want to do, then I won't stop until I'm 79. Even if I never have another good idea. That seems unlikely. I have the feeling that at some point I'm going to want to do something new. At least I hope so. If I live to 79 and from here until there I never have another good idea, then I hope I don't live to 79. So that hammers home the point that you have too much to do. You are not going to get to do all the things you want to do, and you need to make peace with that now. If you haven't, start today. So then deciding that you're going to break off some commitment that you made earlier to somebody, just learning to apologize to people. I thought I was going to be able to do this. It turns out I can't. I'm sorry. They'll live. We have this anxiety in us that makes us think that if we don't follow through on every single one of our commitments, then we're bad people. Start letting go of that now. If you don't, then you will just always have so much too much to do. And so one of the things that I like to do is to have a you're not going to do it party. So I take my whatever various lists of things that I have, however I organize my work, I'll talk about that in just a moment. Every so often, maybe every 3 months or so, I go to my lists and I just start deleting things. I'm never going to do that, I'm never going to do that, I'm never going to do that. And it feels incredibly liberating. It's something that reduces a ton of stress. Now, it's not all easy. There are some things that it breaks my heart that I have to take off my list. Really does. And especially if I've made a commitment to somebody else, where I literally have to throw myself on their mercy and say, look, I'm really sorry. I thought I was going to be able to do this. I am not going to be able to do this. Please forgive me. And that's all you can do. Now, how do we build that list? Well, one of the little tricks that I use is something called getting things done. Again, just like this, I'm not trying to tell you that this is the one true way to take control of your work. In fact, there's a lot of people who look at this stuff, they think of getting things done as a cult. That's not what I'm talking about. But If you start to get control over your workload, then two wonderful things happen. The first is, in the small, you will find it much easier to focus on each individual task as you do it. And when you can focus on each individual task as you do it, then you will do it with fewer mistakes, which means that you will finish sooner. And the second thing that happens is that once you start to get your workload under control, it becomes much easier to think about the bigger questions like, do I need to be doing any of this stuff at all? See, a lot of people look at the book Getting Things Done and they only think about the first half, which is the 5 Ds and how do you manage your inboxes and what is the tickler file and all that stuff. And I think as programmers, we have a tendency when somebody gives us a technique to start thinking immediately about the tools that we're going to use and how we're going to follow the steps. But the second half of that book is all about the big questions, like how do you know what you should be doing? How do you think about they call them areas of responsibility? How do you choose which things you're even going to try to do at all? How do you start practicing saying no to people? How do you start practicing saying no to yourself? How do you control your inbox so that people can't be constantly bombarding you with work requests? That, to me, is the part of getting things done that really where the magic happens. The good news is you can start very simply. So I'm going to give you the 2-minute rule, and I'm going to do it in less than 2 minutes. The 2-minute rule is simple. You can start using it now, and it will make your life a little bit better, probably. When somebody asks you to do something, or when you think of something to do, if you can do it in less than 2 minutes, then do it now, get it out of the way, and never think about it again for the rest of your life. Otherwise, plan it. Otherwise, it has to go into a plan somewhere. That's it. That's the 2-minute rule. The 2-minute rule is very handy because it stops you, for example, from going into work in the morning, opening up your email client, saying, I'll just answer a few emails, and then looking up and it's 11:38. And where did the morning go? This is a perfect example of what happens when you just try to do everything in your inbox without figuring out what needs to be planned. But if there are 3 or 4 reasonably urgent-looking emails that you can handle in 30 seconds each, then do them and get them out of the way. And if somebody stops by your desk and asks you a quick question and you can answer it in 48 seconds, then do it. Now, the funny part of this technique is you probably don't have a good intuitive feeling of how fast 2 minutes goes by. So use a timer. Seriously. You're going to need to train yourself for probably a few months to recognize really how fast 2 minutes goes. Now, of course, the worst thing that you can do when you come up against somebody who is feeling this stressed, who has way too much to do, who has no idea how to move forward, maybe giving them a 240-page book is a bad idea. Please read this. So that's why I wrote something called Getting Started with Getting Things Done, which is a 5-page guide, which is a summary of the key parts of the mechanics of the technique. And the idea is that you can try it out, you can get some rough idea about how overcommitted you are so that you can start thinking about how to fix that. You can start to get your work under control and then decide whether this works well enough that it's worth finding time to read the 240-page book. So you can start with a 2-minute rule. That is my gift to you. You can use that in good health from here for the rest of your life. And even that alone will help. And then if you want, at some point, you can start looking for the phrase getting started with getting things done. If you put my name in there, you will find my article. And if you don't put my name in there, you'll find someone else's article, and I'm sure theirs is quite good too. Once you get your work under control, then you can start to look at these techniques or other techniques like them. So for example, now, all of a sudden, I have some spare capacity that I can use to try to figure out what this TDD thing is, or what this event sourcing thing is, or what this DDD thing is, or whatever technique it is. I finally want to learn functional programming because I'm told that that's going to be the key to the future. Until 15 years from now when there's another key to the future. I don't know what it'll be then. I just know that there will be a whole bunch of people lining up to learn it, so if you learn it first, then you will make a lot of money teaching them. Good luck. And then from there, you can figure out where you want to go. At this point, once you I used this to get the stress of programming work under control. And when I no longer felt significant stress doing programming, then I could finally lift my head up and look around at the other things going on around me. Like, how do I interact with people? Specifically, how do I interact with my customers? Who are my customers? Why are there no customers in this room? Why am I not in the room with the customers? I remember during my time at IBM, I counted there were 17 people between me and a customer. You want to talk about feeling irrelevant? That really works. The idea here is this was a method for building up spare capacity. You probably don't think you have spare capacity because you don't have enough time. You, in fact, do have spare capacity because you probably waste a lot of your energy on things that you don't need to waste it on. All that anxiety that you're feeling is a waste of energy. I'm not saying fixing it is easy. Believe me, if fixing it were easy, I wouldn't be here. But we all have spare capacity. Now it's a question of how can we use it. And something like getting things done is one of the techniques that I use to help me identify my spare capacity, recover some of that, and then invest it in other things. And some of it was investing in recovering from my own stress. And some of it was in practicing things that made the programming part of my work feel a lot less stressful. And you can imagine that this is also about building up spare capacity. A different kind of spare capacity. I think you kind of get the idea now. Look for tools and techniques and ideas and ways of thinking that will help you recover spare capacity. And then figure out how you want to reinvest that. Some of that will be in recovering, and some of that will be in giving that to other people. And some of that will be in spending time practicing the next thing that will help you develop even more spare capacity, which will then help you figure out and practice the next thing, which will allow you to do more and more and more. But ultimately, all of this has, for me, the goal of reducing my stress. I always come back to managing my own energy. If I don't manage my own energy, then the rest of this doesn't matter. And that provides, for me, a compelling reason to practice any of the things that we practice, whether it's using DDD as a way of having a very clear idea of the inner part of what the software really needs to do without being distracted by technology details, because those things really don't matter. Or in using something like TDD as a way for me to build a system that never seems quite terrible enough to throw away and build again. That just always seems like there are little messes, but there's never a big mess that we have to walk around. The individual techniques don't matter. Find things that fit for you. The goal for me is in building up spare capacity, and that helps me feel less stress. So whatever it is that you're doing now, try to look for ways to ask people around you, what do you do to reduce stress? What do you do to build up spare capacity? What do you do to live what for me is kind of the underplayed part of the Agile Manifesto? Maximizing work not done. I don't know what the hell happened to our good friends in the Agile community over the last 20 years. Well, I do know what happened. I don't want to get into that now. But what gets lost and what I want to bring back to the forefront, one of the things that sort of the old extreme programming folks always used to talk about was figuring out the 70% of your work that you shouldn't do and then don't do it. That was the whole point in the first place. The only reason why we didn't call it lightweight software development was because they didn't want to be called lightweights. They thought that that would sound bad. So that's why they chose Agile instead of lightweight. The word is not the problem. Okay. That's as much of that as I'm going to talk about. So this proven path to effectiveness, this is just one way to get there. And what I've learned is that really what I'm trying to do is look for techniques that allow me to identify the capacity that I'm wasting, recover it, and then decide how to reinvest it. That this is really just an instance of using the ideas from theory of constraints. What is your bottleneck? And how do you increase throughput through the bottleneck? And it seems weird, but what you're really looking to do, what I've noticed is that what I've been looking to do is to increase my throughput of energy. How much energy can I bring to my work? So with the little bit of the time that I have left, I want to talk about sort of where this has been going for me. I mean, I've been practicing test-driven development for 20 years now. Actually, you know what? Since I do have enough time, I'm gonna mention this first. I'm gonna pause there, and I want to settle one, not settle, but I want to try to settle one little thing that I notice happening that I don't like, and so I want to try to fix that. Yes, there's the big problem of some people thinking that test-driven development is the one true way to build software. We all know that that's bullshit. That's fine. We're not going to worry about that part. But I've noticed a progression in the way people learn the technique, or that they understand the technique, or their relationship with the technique, that leads to some mild dysfunction that I'd like to try to get under control. At some point, you will read an article out there that said, with the title, TDD isn't about testing. And the title that they really wanted was, TDD isn't about testing, you idiot. But for marketing reasons, they left you idiot off the title. Even though that if you read the article, there's almost certainly some version of you idiot, but with nicer language. And I'm very happy for you that you learned something. That's great. I'm glad that you learned that there can be more to test-driven development than testing. That doesn't make all the people who haven't learned that yet idiots. And it doesn't even make you an idiot for not having known that until now. As Ron Jeffries likes to say, when we learn something, that's good news about today, not bad news about yesterday. And so one of the things that I've noticed is something that I've started calling 3 stages of TDD. Now, I want to be very clear. There's a word missing at the front of this, the definite article the, because these are definitely not the 3 stages of TDD. They're just 3 stages of TDD that I've happened to notice. And when I'm going to draw the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and I do not want you to interpret them as rankings. This is not a video game with levels to conquer. It's just how the passage of time works, that things tend to happen before other things. So we have 3 stages. I've noticed 3 stages of TDD. There might be 37, but I've seen 3 of them so far. And the first 2 stages depend on your bottleneck. So in the first stage, for a lot of people, their bottleneck is bugs, but I don't like to call them bugs because that makes us believe that it's not our fault. So let's talk about mistakes. Mistakes are fine. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes. You make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Apparently, that's how we learn. If you want any more evidence that evolution by natural selection is true, then the fact that we learn by making mistakes is a perfect example, because nobody would design a system that way. So if your mistakes are your bottleneck, then you will probably find the most value by focusing on test-first programming. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, about 5 years after the extreme programming books came out, we stopped talking about test-first programming and started talking about test-driven development. I think because most of people in the community had passed from stage 1 to stage 2. And then we sort of left the words test-first programming behind. So about 5 years ago, I decided to start using test-first programming to refer specifically to just the one rule, thou shalt not write code without a failing test. That's what test-first programming is. End of sentence, that's it. There's nothing else to it. Then the question, of course, becomes what behavior happens after you follow that rule long enough? So in test-first programming, I'm not really worried about how you design things. If you feel comfortable drawing really big diagrams on really big whiteboards for weeks, and then picking some small part of that thing and starting to use tests to help you type the code into the computer correctly, feel free. Because at this point, we're using test-first programming primarily as a testing technique, as a way to avoid making mistakes. In fact, as a way of reducing the time between when you make a mistake and when you notice it. The theory is that if we make this time shorter, then the cost of the mistake goes down. And that's what makes this test-first programming thing work. And so when you start seeing articles with the title, TDD isn't about testing, that's the surest sign that the author has just recently moved from stage 1 to stage 2. And in stage 2, design is their bottleneck. In stage 2, they start to notice Well, I should say, if you stay in stage 1 long enough, then presumably your bug rate goes down. You find your own mistakes much more quickly, much more easily, and the number of mistakes that other people notice you making goes way down, even if the number of mistakes that you notice yourself making goes up. Because part of the whole point is you notice them sooner, and even I can fix a mistake I made in the last 30 seconds. And then eventually, this is no longer your bottleneck. But remember that when you fix your worst problem, your second worst problem gets a promotion. So now, for many people, that is design. Now, I talked about design earlier. So when we talk about design, design is related to the cost to maintain a system over time. But if you say that, that's boring. So if you really want to capture someone's attention, then you can tell them that what you're trying to do is reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features. So the next time that you're in an argument with somebody about whether you should be using evolutionary design to guide the design of a system, whether you should be refactoring or not, then you can just stare at them and say, well, I'm just trying to reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features. Don't you want that? And the funny thing is, clearly they do want that. We want it because it protects our capacity to deliver features. They want it because that's how they get features sooner, even if they don't realize it. Now, if you don't know what the terms mean, volatility just means uncertainty, how often, how wildly things change, and marginal cost just means the cost of the next one. But by phrasing it in these pseudo-economics terms, it sounds more impressive. And especially, and I'm not joking when I say this, I spent probably an entire 2 hours just practicing saying this phrase over and over again so that I could say it that quickly. I just trying to reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features. What's the problem? It's a way of just snapping them to attention. This, when Mike Hill says that he's in TDD for the money, when Martin Fowler puts the reasons for refactoring on a slide and then crosses them all out and puts money on the other side, this is what they mean, as far as I can tell. And when you get into an argument with somebody about whether you should spend time refactoring, it's because they don't buy this yet. Okay. When design is your bottleneck, that means that essentially you are suffering from the problem that the cost to build features over time is going up like this. And because that happens, eventually, at some point, there's a point here, which we like to call project heat death. And that is the point where the cost to continue is higher than the cost of starting over. And that's when all the senior technical staff gets into a single room and they have a very uncomfortable conversation that involves a lot of yelling, the result of which is that we fire the CTO, we start again, we're going to do it in Python, and we're not going to make the same mistakes. Because if you don't pay attention to the design, this is what happens. This is the disease. This is one way to treat the disease. So when design is your worst problem, that's when you become interested in test-driven development. And again, this is for me, mostly a stress-reducing technique. What this allows me to do is, this is when the tests, strangely enough, drive our design decisions. Your tests are the way that your design is crying at you, and you're learning how to interpret those cries. And this is when these authors write these articles called TDD is not about testing, you idiot, it's about design. Well, no. Congratulations. Welcome to stage 2. We've been waiting for you. It's sunny here. The only difference between these two is how much time you spend in the technique and what your worst problem is right now. Let me say that again. The only difference between these stages is how long you spent with the technique and what your worst problem is right now. What's your bottleneck? There's no point in teaching people about test-driven development as a design technique if they are drowning in support calls. You can try, but it's probably not going to help them. But if they get to focus on this for a while, the bad news is they will create some design problems. The good news is that will give them something to practice when they get into stage 2. And then something interesting happens in stage 3. It really now no longer has to do with bottlenecks, but it has more to do with noticing patterns. And I don't really, because I'm in stage 3, I don't know how to describe it very well yet. But the best I can give you is a metaphor. There's the difference in stage 1 and stage 2, you're interested in learning a language. And in stage 1, you're trying to speak the language correctly so that people will understand you. And in stage 2, you're interested in things like style and register and the difference between poetry and prose and that kind of thing. And in stage 3 now, you're talking more about linguistics. I'm interested in patterns in how the tests drive design. I'm interested in these kinds of problems in the tests lead to those kinds of problems or signal these kinds of problems in the production code. These refactorings, these elementary refactorings tend to go together in this sequence very often. Or if I'm in this situation, I know that that refactoring is going to help me. But if I'm in this situation, then I try that refactoring first, and sometimes it helps. And I try that one next, and sometimes that helps. And I try that one next, and sometimes that helps. And the kinds of refactorings that I can do safely in Java, C++, C# are not the same refactorings that I can do safely in PHP, Python, Ruby, Smalltalk, JavaScript. Or the reason that we have to write these kinds of tests in OO languages has to do with the fact that we don't have the same kind of very clear, well-defined library functions of composition that we have in functional programming. Which is why when I try to do this stuff in Elm or Haskell, I notice that after I've tested the tiny pieces, once I'm ready to put the pieces together, there's nothing left to test. And that still makes me uncomfortable. I want to write those tests when I'm working in Ruby, and I see no point in writing those tests when I'm working in Elm. And so things that I would do in one approach or in one context, I wouldn't do in another. As I say, it's the difference between trying to learn a language and learning linguistics. So suddenly now we can stop thinking about test-driven development as a video game with levels to conquer. And instead we can think of where am I and which is my focus. Those of you who are drowning in bugs and need to focus on writing tests first as a way of finding problems in the behavior of the system should not be made to feel bad. That's just stress that you don't need. What I hope is that you look at this model and think, here's where I am, here's what I can focus on, and be happy about it. You're not missing something because you're in stage 1. You're not missing something because you're in stage 2. That's just where you are right now. By the way, if you're in stage 1 and you're trying to practice test-first programming and your bug rate doesn't seem to be going down, then please ask someone, why is this happening? That's not to say that your job is you don't get a cookie for making it to stage 3. But this is what should happen, and if it's not happening, you need help. Go ask for it. We're out there to help you. Again, I share this with you in part because I want to avoid stress. I want to help you be able to feel like you can work with less stress. That's why any of this stuff is interesting to me. And so I want to end with the idea that any of this is interesting only because, not only because, primarily because it allows me to work with less stress, it allows me to manage my energy better. And if I don't take care of myself, then I will not be able to give any of that to other people. Now, I resisted the ideas of nonviolent communication for a long time, primarily because I knew a couple of people who were nonviolent communication proponents, who were some of the most violent people I have ever met, which made me think that there was nothing to it. But when I finally started to read about it, one of the things that really struck me about it was that part of the idea of nonviolent communication is to connect with each other at the level of what are our unmet needs. The reason that we do this is because when we do things for other people, we feel better when we do them out of the purest desire to give with no expectation in return. That's not just altruism, that's not just a moral question, that's actually lies at the center of what makes us feel good. And I know that if I don't take care of myself, if I don't reduce my own stress and manage my own energy, then I will have nothing to give to other people. And so It doesn't matter which techniques you use. Could be test-driven development, getting things done. It could be focusing on test-first programming. It could be DDD. It could be anything. If you focus your energy on figuring out what your energy bottleneck is and how you can build extra capacity, whatever that is that helps you feel better, feel less stress, then, after you've recovered for a while, you will naturally want to start reinvesting that new energy in giving it to other people. You don't have to rush it. If you take care of yourself, then before long, you will give freely, with the joy of a 4-year-old who doesn't know any better, and just give things to other people. And if we just did that, if we all tried doing that starting today, think of how much better everything could be. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Enjoy coffee.